For nearly a year, she lived two lives, one as a loving wife, the other built on a secret she thought would never come to light. September 9th, 2023, was supposed to be a day of celebration in Savannah, Georgia. Family gathered, cameras rolled, and the Johnsons were about to reveal the gender of their first child. But the truth had been waiting its turn, a truth tied to the man her husband trusted most. When she finally spoke his name, everything stopped. One word turned joy into chaos, and a celebration into tragedy. What kind of love hides a secret powerful enough to end a life in front of everyone who came to celebrate it? March 1st, 2023. On a crisp Wednesday evening in suburban Savannah, Georgia, 32-year-old Jason Johnson pulled into his driveway at 6:17 p.m. He climbed out of his work truck, construction helmet in hand, and stepped into the warm glow of the front porch. His wife, 28-year-old Melissa Johnson, greeted him with a quick hug and a soft smile. On the surface, their life looked stable. Jason had built his construction crew from scratch, long hours and call-outs behind the sweat. Melissa taught art classes to local teens, was active in church youth programs, and had a reputation for being warm, outgoing, and devoted. But behind the friendly wave to neighbors and Sunday barbecues in the backyard, subtle tension had begun to creep in. Melissa's phone had become a fixture in her hand. Messages, unseen glances, sometimes abrupt silences when Jason walked into the room. He noticed a shift in her tone. When he asked how her week had gone, she'd say, "Fine." But her eyes betrayed something else. Meanwhile, Jason's own demeanor had changed. His once constant check-in texts to Melissa when he was at the job site had tapered. He blamed the long hours. She took that explanation and nodded politely. Their best friend since childhood, 34-year-old Derek Harris, had become a frequent visitor. Jason and Derek had worked side by side since high school summers, roofing jobs, learning tools, building trust that felt unbreakable. Derek joined them for dinner most Fridays now. Melissa often asked him questions about leasing a second car, remodeling the garage, or ideas for their baby nursery project. What looked like support quietly grew into a third presence in the marriage. When Jason mentioned the frequent dinners, Melissa laughed it off, saying, "Derek is like family." But Jason's voice cracked slightly one evening when he said over takeout, "You've been distant lately." And Melissa answered, "You've been absent." They both stopped speaking after that. Not in anger, but in that hollow quiet that says things are over, long before anyone admits it. One Monday night at 9:45 p.m., Jason waited in the driveway, watching Melissa pull up from work. He asked, "Did you eat?" She shook her head. "Just a snack," she said, sliding down the driver's side window. She touched his shoulder gently and said, "I'll be at Derek's for a little while." She kissed his cheek and walked inside later that night at midnight. Jason wasn't awake when she arrived, found the door locked, and went to sleep on the couch. When he woke the next morning, her makeup case was on the hallway floor, lipstick smudged, though Melissa said the case must have fallen from her drawer. He accepted it, but his doubt chipped at him. By June, friends noted Melissa seemed preoccupied. At church the Sunday after Father's Day, she sat with her eyes unfocused, quietly turning a napkin in her lap. Jason slid into the pew beside her and touched her arm. She stared straight ahead and said quietly, "I'm tired." That was new. In the months before the reveal, they argued less, but spoke even less. Neighbors recalled hearing muffled voices, not shouting, just words carried in the dark from their sliding glass door. "I can't keep doing this," Melissa said once. Jason replied, "I know you're unhappy." Later he told a friend at the job site, "I just don't know what changed." She nodded at the bushes, looking off. To the neighbors, they were the picture of love. But every photo had someone faking the smile. The stage was set, the conflict unspoken. The countdown had begun, and something no one saw, yet, was coming. By April 2023, Savannah was in full bloom, and the Johnsons' life looked perfectly normal from the outside. Jason left for construction work before sunrise most mornings, and Melissa spent her days teaching art to middle schoolers at the community center. But if anyone had looked closer, they would have noticed the distance. Small, quiet, and growing. Melissa had started staying late at work, sometimes until 8 or 9 p.m., even when no projects were due. When her co-worker, Nancy Lopez, asked why, she smiled and said, "Just prepping lesson plans." But the center's security logs later showed she'd left the building hours before she said she did. People noticed, but no one asked again. At home, Jason was still trying to be the husband he thought Melissa needed. He'd cook simple dinners, leave notes on the fridge, and ask how her day went. Most nights she'd answer without looking up from her phone. One evening, around 7:45 p.m., he asked if she'd be home for dinner. "Don't wait up," she said. "The girls from work want to grab a drink." She returned near midnight. Jason noticed the faint scent of cologne, not hers, on her jacket. When he mentioned it, she laughed softly and said, "You're imagining things, babe." Jason's mother, Denise Johnson, had been watching her son fade. When she stopped by one Sunday for lunch, she pulled him aside in the kitchen. "She's not the same girl you married," she said quietly. He replied, "She's just tired. The pregnancy's wearing her out." Denise frowned. Tired women don't smile at their phones that much. Jason's only response was a long exhale before he said, "I trust her, Mom. I have to." A few weeks later, Melissa's best friend, Alicia Harris, recalled a conversation that stayed with her long after the tragedy. They were sitting in Melissa's car outside a grocery store when Melissa said, "Do you ever feel like you're married to someone who stopped seeing you?" Alicia asked what she meant. Melissa shrugged. "Jason's good, just too good. It's like living with a man who doesn't need you anymore." Alicia thought it was just hormones talking, but that one line would later feel like a confession hiding in plain sight. In May, Jason left work early to surprise Melissa with lunch. He opened his truck door and found a half-empty cup sitting in the holder. A lipstick stain on the rim, a deep shade of red he'd never seen her wear. When he asked her about it that night, she froze for half a second before smiling. "Oh, that must be from Alicia. She borrowed my lipstick the other day." Jason didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "Okay." But later, while taking out the trash, he noticed the same shade of lipstick in the bottom of the bathroom drawer, unused. Small cracks kept showing. Melissa started posting vague quotes online. "Sometimes you have to let go to find peace. The truth hurts before it heals." Her co-workers said she was glowing differently, a phrase Jason overheard once at a church brunch that made him leave early. Derek had also become a familiar face again. He'd drop by on weekends, offer to help with house repairs, and joke about Jason overworking himself. "You're making us all look bad, man," Derek said once, clapping him on the back. Jason laughed, but Melissa's laughter sounded different. One night, around June 10th, Jason walked in unexpectedly from a canceled shift and heard voices in the kitchen. Melissa and Derek were sitting close at the table, talking quietly. He heard Derek say, "You don't owe anyone an explanation." When Jason stepped in, both looked startled. "Didn't expect you home yet," Derek said with a grin. Jason answered calmly, "Neither did I." Melissa immediately started clearing dishes, her hands trembling. That silence that followed told Jason more than any words could. Later that week, Jason asked her directly, "Is there something I should know?" Melissa paused before replying, "You're overthinking. Derek's your friend, Jason." He pressed again, "And what are you to him?" She stared at him, eyes cold, and said, "Someone who listens." That answer stayed with him for months. The people around them saw flashes of the truth, but brushed them aside. Melissa's co-workers gossiped quietly about the new bracelet she wore, a gold chain with a small letter D charm. She said it was from a student's parent. Jason's mother noticed the same bracelet during a Sunday visit and asked, "Who's D?" Melissa smiled. "It stands for daughter. We're naming her something that starts with D." It was a lie no one could have understood yet. By July, Jason's sleep had become restless. He often sat on the porch until dawn, watching the streetlights fade. One morning, his neighbor Pete saw him still outside at 6 a.m. and joked, "You keeping watch, man?" Jason smiled faintly and said, "Just making sure the world's still turning." In his private notebook found later by detectives, he wrote, "I'm trying to believe her. Every time I do, something new makes me doubt again." On August 2nd, Jason's mother visited again. She noticed Melissa's ring missing and asked, "Where's your wedding band?" Melissa said, "My fingers swell sometimes." Denise looked at her quietly before replying, "Swelling doesn't make you take it off at work." That tension simmered quietly, but Jason kept defending her. "She's just tired, Mom. You're reading too much into it." Denise gave him one last look and said, "Sometimes love makes you blind to what everyone else can see." By mid-August, the town's whispers had started to grow. A neighbor saw Melissa's car parked outside Derek's auto shop after dark. A co-worker mentioned seeing her at a diner across town on a weekday afternoon. Not at the art center like she'd claimed. But rumors are fragile things. No one wanted to ruin a marriage or assume the worst. Savannah was small, and people believed in minding their business. In early September, Jason finally caught a glimpse of her phone screen lighting up on the nightstand. A message preview flashed briefly before it locked. "He doesn't suspect anything. Tomorrow we'll know." He sat there in the dark, staring at the glow fading from the screen. The next morning, he couldn't bring himself to ask her. He convinced himself it was about the baby shower plans. That small act of denial would soon cost him everything. Everyone around them had seen hints. The late nights, the missing ring, the unfamiliar perfume, the way Melissa's laughter softened when Derek entered the room. But no one said anything. People always think they'll have more time to speak up, more time to warn someone before things go too far. They never do. Jason trusted her because love told him to, not because logic did, and that trust was already cracking under its own weight. If he had faced what his gut was trying to tell him, if he had opened that letter that was soon to arrive, the one that would quietly hold the truth about his marriage, maybe none of this would have happened. By the end of that month, the house was quieter than ever. Jason would wake before dawn to leave for work, but Melissa no longer told him to drive safe. Their goodbyes had become nods, their conversations short and practiced. To outsiders, it looked like two people preparing for parenthood. In truth, it was a countdown to something far different. And in the small town of Savannah, where everyone thought they knew the Johnsons, no one realized that every unasked question and every silent night was leading them straight toward a tragedy that would shock them all. It was Friday, September 8th, 2023. The Georgia heat was just beginning to soften into evening as Jason Johnson sat at the kitchen table, staring at the glow of his phone. Melissa had gone upstairs to pack decorations for the next day's gender reveal party. From the living room came the sound of wrapping paper and tape, but Jason barely heard it. His hands moved slowly across the table, scrolling through Melissa's messages. What he saw made his stomach turn. A text appeared at the top of the screen, sent at 4:37 p.m. that afternoon. It read, "Tomorrow's going to be beautiful. He'll finally know." The name above it wasn't a woman from her art class or a family member. It was Derek. For nearly a minute, Jason didn't breathe. His thumb hovered over the phone, then froze. He opened the thread, reading line after line, short, coded exchanges that had no reason to exist between his wife and his best friend. "He's still clueless," one message said. Another, "Don't worry. Once he hears it, he'll understand everything." Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. But he didn't shout. He didn't confront her. Instead, he placed the phone face down and stared at the table for a long time. Melissa came downstairs minutes later, smiling. "I printed the banners," she said. "Can you pick up extra ice tomorrow?" Jason looked up and forced a nod. "Yeah, sure." He watched her walk past him, her energy light, her voice calm. If she noticed the tension in his face, she didn't mention it. He spent the rest of that evening trying to convince himself he'd misunderstood everything. Maybe "he'll finally know" meant the baby's gender. Maybe it was harmless, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. At 10:24 p.m., Jason sat on the edge of the bed with his laptop open. He typed into the search bar, "How to order a paternity test online." The screen showed a dozen options. He clicked the first link and filled out the form mechanically. His name, her name, and a note to himself. Mail kit to home address. He didn't know what he was hoping to find, only that he needed something to quiet the storm building in his chest. Before clicking confirm order, he looked over at Melissa, who had fallen asleep, her hand resting on her belly. For a brief second, the sight softened him. He closed the laptop without placing the order, but 10 minutes later, he opened it again and pressed submit. Sometime after midnight, Jason walked out to the porch. The air smelled like rain. Across the street, the neighbor's house still had lights on, laughter spilling from an open window. It reminded him of how things used to be. Loud, simple, full of trust. He tried to remember the last time he and Melissa had laughed like that. He couldn't. He looked at her car in the driveway and whispered, "What are you hiding from me?" Around 12:45 a.m., Melissa's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Jason glanced toward it and saw the preview. Can't believe it's really happening. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Every word confirmed what he already feared. He laid down next to her, eyes open, staring at the ceiling until the early hours. At 6:13 a.m., he heard the mail truck outside. The paternity test kit had arrived faster than expected. He saw the small white envelope resting against the mailbox and hesitated before bringing it inside. He turned it over, reading the return label. Genetic Testing Laboratories, Houston, TX. He placed it on the kitchen counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. Melissa came downstairs a few minutes later, humming to herself. "You're up early," she said. Jason nodded. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." She didn't notice the envelope sitting right behind her as she reached for her phone. By mid-morning, the house was alive with noise. Balloons being inflated, folding chairs set up in the yard, relatives arriving with casseroles and gifts. To everyone else, it was a celebration, but to Jason, it was a test of endurance. Every smile felt like an act. Every laugh felt forced. His best friend Derek arrived just before noon, carrying a tray of cupcakes. "You ready, man?" Derek asked. Jason hesitated before answering. "Yeah, big day." The words came out tight. Derek clapped him on the shoulder. "You're going to be a great dad, Jay." Jason forced a smile. "We'll see." As the day went on, Melissa moved gracefully from guest to guest, glowing in her pink sundress. Jason stayed quiet, greeting people, staying close but not close enough to draw attention. Every time Derek spoke to Melissa, Jason noticed how naturally they stood together, too comfortably, too familiar. A few guests noticed it too, but shrugged it off. "They've known each other forever," someone said. The morning of September 9th, 2023, the day of the gender reveal, the Johnsons' backyard in Savannah, Georgia, was strung with pink and blue streamers. Country music played from a small Bluetooth speaker, and relatives passed around cupcakes with question mark frosting. On camera, it all looked picture perfect. Jason stood beside Melissa, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on her shoulder. His best friend, Derek Harris, filmed the crowd, joking that the video would go viral. Laughter rippled through the yard. For a few brief minutes, everyone believed this was what happiness looked like. At 3 p.m., Melissa walked over to Jason and whispered, "Ready?" He nodded. The guests gathered in the backyard, cameras out, children running around the grass. The confetti cannons waited on a small table beside the cake. Jason stood beside his wife, hands in his pockets, eyes unfocused. When the countdown began, 5, 4, 3, his mind wasn't on the balloons or the reveal. It was on that message from the night before. He'll finally know. At that exact moment, across the kitchen counter, the unopened envelope still sat where he left it, next to a stack of napkins. It would later be logged into evidence, still sealed. The party exploded in cheers. Pink confetti shot into the air. Melissa laughed, hugging Jason as guests clapped. To them, it was a perfect moment of joy. But to Jason, the world had gone silent. Every sound felt far away. He could see Derek's face smiling in the crowd, could see Melissa glowing under the sunlight, and in that split second, a thought crossed his mind that he couldn't shake. She's hiding something right in front of everyone. As guests took photos, Melissa leaned toward him and said, "We did it." Jason looked at her, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "We sure did." The confetti, the cake, the laughter, none of it was celebration. It was camouflage, hiding a truth waiting to explode. Before the story continues, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you've made it this far, type "I'm still here." Let's see who's watching closely, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and truth. At 3:17 p.m., Melissa took the microphone. Her voice trembled slightly, but she smiled as she looked at Jason. "We're naming her Derica," she said, "after Uncle Derek." For a second, the guests clapped and laughed. Then the noise faded. Cameras kept rolling, but Jason's face drained of color. The hand on Melissa's shoulder fell away. He stared at her as if he hadn't heard correctly. A cousin's video later captured him saying quietly, "What did you just say?" Melissa laughed nervously and reached for his hand, whispering, "It's a joke, baby. Don't make it weird." But her voice cracked on. The last word. Derek froze near the grill, his expression unreadable. One of the guests, later interviewed by detectives, said she saw Jason's jaw tighten and his eyes fix on Derek. Another recalled that Melissa tried to change the subject, calling for more music, but her hands were shaking. Jason leaned in close enough that only she could hear him and said, "You named her after him." She whispered back, "It's just a name." He answered, "No, it's not." The atmosphere shifted. The laughter died. People began pretending to check their phones, sensing something wrong. Derek took a step forward, muttering, "Hey, let's not do this now." Jason turned toward him and said calmly, "Stay out of this." Someone turned up the music to cut the tension. Melissa forced a smile, excused herself, and took Jason's arm. Together, they walked inside the house. A neighbor's doorbell camera recorded them entering at 3:29 p.m. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes. Inside, Jason shut the door and asked, "How long?" Melissa stood by the counter, hands trembling. "You're overreacting," she said. "It's just a name." He stepped closer. "How long, Melissa?" Her eyes filled and she whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Jason blinked hard. "So it did happen?" She said nothing. The silence between them was louder than shouting. Jason backed away, running both hands over his face. He said quietly, "You picked his name for our baby. You knew what you were doing." Melissa reached for him. "Please, let's talk about this later. Not today. Not with everyone outside." He shook his head slowly. "You already said everything." Witnesses outside heard muffled voices, then a single sharp sound, a gunshot, at 3:33 p.m. The music stopped mid-song. Guests froze. A woman screamed. Derek dropped the camera and ran toward the door, followed by several others. When they burst inside, Melissa was on the floor near the dining table, blood pooling around her. Jason was on his knees beside her, his hands and shirt soaked red. He kept whispering. She said his name. One guest grabbed the phone from the counter and dialed 911. When the 911 audio was later released to the public, it revealed the chaos that followed the gunshot. The dispatcher's calm voice came first, asking, "Savannah County 911, what's your emergency?" The caller, still trembling, tried to explain through sobs that there had been a shooting at the Johnson residence and that the victim was pregnant. The dispatcher asked if the suspect was still on scene, to which the caller replied that Jason Johnson was sitting on the floor beside his wife's body. He wasn't yelling, resisting, or trying to escape, just sitting there, covered in blood, murmuring to her. The operator's voice, steady and controlled, guided the witness through basic instructions until officers arrived, but nothing about that call could have prepared them for what they would find inside. By the time Detective Angela Pierce arrived at the Johnson residence just after 4 p.m. on September 9, 2023, the first responders had already secured the scene and logged the firearm. Officer Maria Collins had confirmed Melissa Johnson dead at 3:50 p.m., and the suspect, her husband, Jason Johnson, was still inside, sitting motionless on the floor. Within the next hour, Pierce would finish her walkthrough, collect initial statements, and authorize Jason's transport to the precinct at exactly 5:22 p.m. The timeline was tight, and every second mattered. When Pierce stepped inside the home, the smell of gunpowder still lingered faintly beneath the sugary scent of cake. The backyard that was meant for celebration now looked like a battlefield. Pink balloons sagged against the fence. Folding chairs lay tipped in the grass. Confetti, once a symbol of joy, clung to wet footprints near the porch steps. Inside, Jason sat in the living room, eyes unfocused, hands streaked with blood. He kept repeating the same phrase, his voice distant. "She named my baby after him." Pierce crouched next to him and said calmly, "Jason, look at me. Tell me what happened here." He blinked once before answering. "She said his name," he whispered, "and I couldn't breathe." Officers had already bagged the revolver, a .38 caliber registered to Jason, and placed it on the kitchen counter in an evidence container. The table where Melissa had fallen was still set with paper plates and half-opened gifts. One of the baby shower cards read, "To the best parents-to-be." Pierce dictated into her recorder as she moved through the room. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of external struggle. Crime appears confined to domestic dispute. Her tone was steady, but her notes hinted at something more complex. Outside, the scene was a mix of grief and confusion. Guests were sobbing, some clutching one another, others staring blankly at the house. One woman kept saying, "She was smiling. I swear she was smiling." Detectives began pulling people aside for statements. Every story conflicted. Some said Melissa had been laughing when Jason took her inside. Others insisted she looked terrified. One cousin claimed he heard Melissa whisper, "Please don't do this." Another remembered Jason's face as white as paper. No one could agree on whether Melissa screamed before the gun went off. Derek Harris sat near the fence, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his hands trembling. Detective Pierce approached him carefully. "You're Derek?" He nodded. "Best friend?" Another nod. "Were you in the house when it happened?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was outside. I didn't even realize what she said until people stopped laughing." His voice cracked. "He just looked at me. I didn't know what to do." Pierce studied him quietly before asking, "Had you and Melissa ever been involved?" Derek's eyes widened. "No, never. She was my friend." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know she'd say my name. God, why would she do that?" Inside, Jason remained calm as paramedics carried Melissa's body away. When an officer began reading him his rights, he interrupted. "I'm not trying to hide anything," he said. "It's done. I just want to know why she said it." Pierce watched him for a long moment before motioning for him to be escorted outside. She noticed the mail pile on the counter and one small white envelope among the stack, addressed to Jason Johnson from Genetic Testing Laboratories, Houston, TX. She logged it as evidence. Later testing would confirm that the unborn child was not Jason's. The cruelest part was timing. The package had arrived the same morning Melissa revealed the baby's name. At 4:55 p.m., Pierce completed her scene notes and gave the command to transfer Jason into custody. By 5:22, he was in the back of the cruiser, staring blankly out the window. Officer Collins later recalled his only words during transport. She said it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't anger in his tone. It was disbelief. That night, as Pierce reviewed the witness interviews, one detail caught her attention. A co-worker told investigators that Melissa had seemed distracted but determined the morning of the party. She'd told a friend she planned to surprise Jason in a big way. The co-worker thought she meant the gender announcement. But when detectives examined Melissa's phone, the truth surfaced. Her final message to Derek, sent just hours before the shooting, read, "He'll find out soon, but it needs to come from me." It was clear now. Melissa had planned the announcement alone. She wanted the world to know before Jason found out privately. For a brief moment, detectives suspected Derek's involvement, maybe as an accomplice or someone who provoked the confrontation. But phone data told a different story. Derek's location never left the backyard. His texts stopped the night before, and his phone remained untouched during the shooting. The betrayal was real, but the murder was Jason's alone. As darkness fell, Pierce walked through the now empty yard. The wind carried bits of confetti past her feet. The house lights glowed faintly through the curtains, an eerie reminder of what the day was supposed to be. One of the younger officers stood beside her, shaking his head. "You think he planned it?" Pierce exhaled slowly. "No, I think he loved her so much it broke him." The officer glanced toward the house. "So what do we call that?" Pierce answered quietly. Heartbreak wearing anger's face. If you've made it this far, take a second to breathe. Stories like this remind us how thin the line is between love and tragedy. If you're still here, drop a comment saying I'm still watching. And if this story hit you, share it to remind someone you love that silence, secrets, and pride can destroy more than truth ever could. The investigation was only beginning, and the truth was about to hurt everyone left behind. The digital timeline began almost exactly a year before the gender reveal, and Detective Angela Pierce treated it like a second crime scene. She received the first phone extraction at 8:12 a.m. on September 11, 2023, a Celebrite report that stacked messages into neat columns and timestamps. At the top was an innocuous thread titled "Garage Shelves Estimate," created on September 22, 2022, between Melissa Johnson and Derek Harris. The first line read, "Could you look at the garage on Saturday? I need help with storage for the baby stuff later." Derek responded within 5 minutes. "I'll swing by after lunch, won't charge you much." What began as work help would become everything else. By October 5, 2022, the tone had shifted in small ways that only look obvious later. Melissa wrote, "Thanks for fixing the light. Jason's been swamped." Derek sent back, "Anything for you," then added a second bubble, "I mean for you and Jay. LOL." The LOL did work it had no business doing, softening a line that had already stepped over a line. A week later, while Jason was on a Sunday overtime shift, the thread turned from parts and paint to playlists and late-night shows. On October 16th at 11:43 p.m., Melissa texted, "Can't sleep," and Derek replied, "Me either. You're not the only one." It was the first message Pierce highlighted in red. Thanksgiving brought the first unmistakable fracture. On November 24, 2022, at 2:07 p.m., Melissa texted from her mother's kitchen, "He and my uncle are watching the game again. I'm here chopping onions like a ghost." Derek wrote, "You're not a ghost to me." She answered, "Don't say that." And then 3 minutes later, "Say it again." When Pierce read that exchange in the squad room, she circled both lines and wrote in the margin, "Consent to attention, denial and invitation in 2 breaths." That pattern would repeat for months. By December, daily messages turned into calls. The extraction showed 13 voice calls between December 3rd and December 29th, most of them between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. When Pierce subpoenaed carrier logs, tower pings put Derek near his shop while Melissa's phone hit the sector nearest her subdivision. On December 21st, at 12:12 a.m., Melissa typed, "It feels wrong when it's quiet in the house." And Derek answered, "It feels wrong when it's quiet in my head unless I'm talking to you." She replied, "Don't make me miss you." He answered, "Too late." The next morning, Melissa Googled how to reset iMessage settings, as if silence could be configured. January 2023 brought the first explicit confession of loneliness. On January 9th at 8:03 p.m., Melissa messaged her friend Alicia Harris, If Jason ever finds out, I'll lose everything. When Alicia wrote back, "What did you do?" Melissa replied, "Nothing yet, but I'm thinking thoughts I shouldn't be thinking." Alicia later told Pierce she called that night and said, "Talk to your husband before you talk to anyone else." In the interview room, Alicia's hands shook as she added, she laughed and said, "You really think talking fixes love?" The recorder captured only the faint scrape of Alicia's ring against the table after that. Valentine's Day was the first physical boundary crossed on screen. On February 14th at 11:18 p.m., Derek sent a photo of a takeout bag on a doorstep with the text, "For you. Check the porch." Melissa replied 4 minutes later, "You're going to get me in trouble." He sent a pin drop of his location and wrote, "I'm in my truck. I'll wait." The call that followed lasted 47 minutes, ending at 12:09 a.m. Jason's phone, according to his Google timeline, was at a downtown job site he had secured overnight. When Pierce laid those data points side by side, the column of numbers felt like a confession. Spring is when the messages turned from curiosity to attachment. On April 3rd at 9:56 p.m., Melissa texted Derek, "I can't stop thinking about you." He answered immediately, "Then don't." She wrote, "This is a mistake." And 4 seconds later, "But I'm not closing the door." 2 days after that, Melissa purchased a gold bracelet online. The receipt went to her personal email, not the shared household account. When Pierce asked Alicia about the bracelet, Alicia said, "She told me it stood for daughter. She said they were brainstorming baby names that started with D." The explanation had sounded cute then, like a family secret. It sounded different on paper. The tone of Derek's messages hardened in May. On May 12th at 1:22 p.m., Melissa wrote, "He's been asking questions." And Derek replied, "Then stop giving him reasons to ask." She sent, "I feel trapped." And he wrote, "You feel free with me." Later that week, after Melissa didn't answer for 6 hours, his texts stacked up in a dozen gray bubbles. "Where are you? Pick up. Don't do this. Say something." When she finally responded at 11:41 p.m., "I was with my mom," he answered. "You're with me when I need you." Pierce underlined that line twice. Affection had become instruction. On June 10th at 6:07 p.m., the extraction captured a thread that read like a turning point. Melissa, "He came home early and saw us talking in the kitchen." Derek, "We said nothing wrong." Melissa, "It didn't feel like nothing." Derek, "Then we'll be more careful." She sent, "Careful feels like lying." He replied, "Careful is how we get what we want." In her notes, Pierce wrote, "Pivot. Language of partnership sliding into language of strategy." The detective didn't need a psychology degree to hear the edge sharpening. Pregnancy recalibrated every message that followed. On July 2nd at 10:31 a.m., Melissa texted a photo of a faint test line. "I think I'm late for a reason." Derek answered, "Call me now." The call lasted 3 minutes, too short for comfort, too long for denial. At 11:22 a.m., Melissa sent, "I don't know whose it is." And at 11:23 a.m., "That doesn't mean what you think it means." Derek wrote back, "If it's mine, we'll figure it out." And then 16 minutes later, "But don't say anything yet." When Pierce read that last sentence, she flipped back through earlier months to trace every time secrecy had been dressed up as safety. By late July, control had replaced comfort. On July 24th at 9:08 p.m., Melissa wrote, "Jason asked why my ring's off." Derek answered, "Tell him it's swelling. Stop leaving it places." She replied, "I don't need instructions." And he shot back, "You do if you're going to keep this clean." The next morning at 7:16 a.m., Melissa texted Alicia, "I hate being told what to do by someone who doesn't have to live my life." Alicia responded, "Then stop letting him." Melissa never answered that thread. Instead, she sent Derek a heart at 7:48 a.m., a habit Pierce saw repeat after every moment of pushback, a small peace offering to reset the temperature. August brought the first explicit threat of exposure from inside the triangle. On August 8th at 10:02 p.m., Melissa wrote, "I have to tell Jason before someone else does." Derek replied, "No." She sent, "He deserves the truth." And he answered, "He deserves peace." After a pause, a new bubble appeared from Derek. "If you want to keep me, you won't hurt him like that in public." Pierce stared at that sentence longer than most. The words sounded almost protective if you didn't ask who they were meant to protect. The detective added a bracketed note, possession as empathy, leverage wrapped as care, and moved on. The most damaging lines arrived the week of the party. On September 7th at 9:41 p.m., Melissa texted, "I'm saying a name at the reveal." Derek wrote, "Don't be dramatic." She answered, "It's not drama, it's honesty." He replied, "If you humiliate him, you humiliate me." At 9:55 p.m., she sent, "Then pick a name you can live with." He did not reply, and the thread went silent for 12 hours. The next day, the message that later sent Jason's hands shaking appeared at 4:37 p.m. "Tomorrow's going to be beautiful. He'll finally know." It was sent from Derek's phone, and it ended the argument without solving anything. Pierce wasn't done. She pulled voicemail archives and found an unsent recording in Melissa's Notes app, dated September 8th at 11:58 p.m. Melissa's voice was quiet and steady. "Jason, I should have told you sooner. I made a mess out of the truth, and I'm not asking you to forgive me for that. I'm asking you to look at me while I say the rest." The file ended there, cut off mid-breath, like she'd lost the courage or timed out on her nerve. When Pierce played it a second time, she closed her eyes for the last line. The human part of the job never got easier. Interviews added context that data alone couldn't. A clerk at a diner off Abercorn Street remembered seeing Melissa and Derek in a corner booth in late August. Not romantic exactly, but not friendly either. A cashier at a pharmacy recalled Melissa buying prenatal vitamins with cash and a second receipt for a pressure cuff. Alicia told Pierce, she said, "If he ever finds out, I'll lose everything." And then she said, "But I can't live like this." When Pierce asked, which he did she mean? Alicia whispered, "Both." The tape caught the air conditioner hum as the truth landed in that room. Derek denied knowing about the pregnancy with a calm flatness that made the transcripts feel colder. In his first interview on September 10th at 3:14 p.m., Pierce asked, "Did Melissa tell you she was pregnant?" He said, "No." She slid a printout across the table and tapped the July 2nd thread. "She told me it's probably yours," the detective read aloud. Derek didn't look at the paper. He looked at his hands. After a long pause, he said, "She was scared, okay? She said a lot of things." Pierce asked, "Which parts did you believe?" He answered, "The parts that were good for both of us." That line would read the same no matter which light you held it in. Jason's side of the year looked quieter on paper and heavier in person. His phone carried fewer words and more maps, routes from job sites to home, late-night walks logged by a health app he didn't remember enabling, a note on September 1st at 2:14 a.m. that read, "I want to ask, but I don't want to hear." When Pierce interviewed him 2 days after the shooting, he kept returning to one detail. "I ordered a test," he said. "I thought if the paper told me, I wouldn't have to hear it." Pierce didn't tell him about the voicemail or the diner or the pressure cuff. Investigations ration truth, the way the living ration air. By the afternoon of September 12th, Pierce had the year arranged in boxes and lines across a whiteboard. October, attention. February, threshold. April, attachment. July, pregnancy. August, control. September, exposure. She drew a thin arrow from affection to instruction to leverage, then wrote the word timing above all of it. The unopened paternity envelope sat in an evidence locker in another building, but its shadow stretched over every board she drew. The detective stood back with her pen capped and said to no one, what started as comfort turned into a contract he never signed. The final pieces came from Melissa's calendar and a single shared note labeled Saturday Plans. It listed balloon pickup 11, Cupcakes, Derek 12 and one line that didn't match the others. Say it. Say it gently. Say it to his face. The phone timestamped that edit at 8:04 a.m. on September 9th, an hour before guests arrived. Pierce read it twice and set the device down. In another folder, a delivery confirmation showed the genetic kit had been scanned at the mailbox at 6:13 a.m. the same morning. Two truths were walking toward each other from opposite ends of the same day. What started as affection became manipulation, the detective narrated into her recorder as she closed the file for the night. And love turned into leverage. On the board, the words looked academic, but inside the rooms where they had been spoken, they had felt like oxygen. Jason's guilt now mixed with confusion in every answer he gave. He mourned the woman he loved and the promises he thought he'd kept. Derek's denial narrowed to a single line he would not cross. I didn't know. The phone records had already written a different sentence. She told me it's probably yours. At 9:03 p.m., Pierce printed one last report, an auto backup from Melissa's cloud that the tech team had finished restoring. It included a draft text never sent, saved at 2:06 p.m. on the day of the party. After today, we don't lie anymore. There was no recipient selected. The cursor blinked after the last word, waiting for a name. Pierce stared at the blank 2, bar, and felt that familiar ache in her chest, the one that comes when a story is about to stop being theory and start being verdict. She slid the draft into an evidence sleeve, marked the bag, and reached for the next folder in the stack, the lab envelope with Jason's name on it, sealed, logged, and ready to be opened. The courtroom was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Jason Johnson sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him. Across the room, Derek Harris avoided eye contact, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight. Detective Angela Pierce was on the witness stand, holding a slim white envelope sealed inside an evidence bag. The label read, Genetic Testing Laboratories, Results Enclosed. When the prosecutor asked what it contained, Pierce replied, The DNA results of the unborn child. The judge nodded for her to continue. Pierce drew a breath and said clearly, The results confirm that the child was not Jason Johnson's. The biological father is Derek Harris. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps. Reporters scribbled, camera shutters clicked, and Derek's attorney leaned over whispering, Say nothing. Jason didn't move. He'd already known the truth. He just needed to hear it aloud. The silence between knowing and hearing was the longest moment of his life. He just stared at the envelope, the same one that had been sitting on his kitchen counter the morning Melissa died. The fourth defense attorney stood and said, Your Honor, the defense wishes to enter new evidence confirming that Mr. Johnson had already ordered that same test days before the incident. It was delivered on the morning of September 9th, 2023, hours before the gender reveal party. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, letting the words hang. One juror covered her mouth. Detective Pierce continued, her voice steady. We found the unopened package at the scene, just feet from where Mrs. Johnson was found. The judge asked, And to your knowledge, did the defendant ever open it? Pierce shook her head. No, sir, he never did, but he knew what it meant. The prosecutor stepped forward. So, Detective, if Mr. Johnson had that envelope in his possession, what stopped him from opening it? Pierce hesitated, then said softly, Maybe he didn't want the truth on paper. Maybe he just needed to hear her say it out loud. The jury watched as body cam footage from that morning played on the courtroom monitor. It showed Jason walking to the mailbox at 6:13 a.m., a coffee cup in one hand. He reached in, pulled out a small white envelope, glanced at the return address, and froze. The camera from a neighbor's doorbell caught him standing there for a few seconds before setting it on the porch railing. He took one long breath, then muttered, Bad news can wait a day. Those words were later quoted in court by Detective Pierce when she testified about his emotional state. During closing arguments, the prosecutor's tone was measured. Jason Johnson did not plan this murder, but he planned denial. He wanted to believe that ignoring the truth could change it, and when denial met reality, it became tragedy. The defense countered with a plea for compassion, reminding the jury of Jason's clean record, his years of work, and the fact that he'd never once raised a hand to anyone. He wasn't angry, his lawyer said. He was broken. He trusted love to tell him the truth. But love lied. Witnesses recalled small details that now carried unbearable weight. A guest from the party told the court, "He wasn't yelling, he wasn't wild. He looked like a man who'd stopped existing before he ever pulled the trigger." Another said, "When she said that name, you could see his whole body change, like the air went out of him." Derek was subpoenaed but invoked his Fifth Amendment right on most questions. When asked if he knew about the test, he admitted, "I knew he was suspicious. Melissa told me she thought he'd ordered one. I told her not to worry." The prosecutor leaned closer. "Not to worry about what?" Derek hesitated, then said, "About who the father might be." As the verdict drew near, Pierce revisited her final report. The evidence formed a timeline that could no longer be ignored. Jason's order placed on September 4th, confirmation email on September 6th, package delivered on September 9th at 6:13 a.m. By 3:33 p.m., Melissa was gone. The test that could have answered everything arrived 7 hours too early and remained sealed. Pierce's voice echoed through the courtroom recording. He once said bad news could wait a day, but that day, it didn't. The judge called a recess, and the crowd spilled into the hallway. Reporters surrounded Pierce, asking if she believed Jason meant to kill his wife. She answered carefully, "I think he meant to find peace. He just didn't know what kind of peace that was going to be." Inside his holding cell later that evening, Jason asked his attorney for a copy of the DNA results. The attorney handed him the paper through the slot. Jason stared at it for nearly a minute before folding it neatly and saying, "I already knew." The guard who overheard later said it wasn't bitterness in his voice. It was relief, as if knowing had finally caught up with feeling. As the credits of their lives rolled out in court transcripts and case summaries, one truth lingered. Love had not killed Melissa Johnson. Pride, secrecy, and the unbearable need for answers had. The test that could have saved 3 lives arrived right on time, but no one opened it. Thank you for standing with us through this story. If you're still here, it means you value the truth behind every case we tell. Join our channel membership today to help us continue producing real stories that matter, uncovering lessons from tragedies like this one, and reminding the world that every silence hides a story waiting to be told. It was late spring of 2024 when Melissa Johnson's family began clearing out what was left of her life. The house on Whitfield Avenue still smelled faintly of baby lotion and vanilla candles, the kind she used to burn every evening after work. Her sister, Rebecca, carried out boxes of folded baby clothes that would never be worn. "We'll donate them," she whispered, her voice trembling as she held up a small pink onesie with Daddy's Girl written in glittered letters. Her mother stood silently by the doorway, staring at the nursery. Pastel walls painted with clouds and soft stars. A white crib still stood in the corner, untouched since the day police taped off the room. The only sound was the slow creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, and the faint hum of the refrigerator, where a single ultrasound photo was still held by a magnet that read, "Baby Derica, coming soon." As boxes filled the living room, Rebecca found Melissa's journal wedged under a couch cushion. The last entry was dated August 29, 2023. It read, "Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe love won't hurt so much when I stop pretending." There was no entry after that. Outside, neighbors watched quietly as furniture was carried out. No one spoke to the family. Some were sympathetic, others were uneasy. To them, the Johnson house wasn't a home anymore. It was a monument to questions that would never be answered. A woman dead, a husband imprisoned, a friend in hiding, and an unborn child caught in the middle of it all. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, inside the Georgia State Correctional Facility, Jason Johnson sat at a metal desk under the hum of a fluorescent light. He had lost track of time. Days and nights blurred into one long stretch of regret. The guard who made his evening round said Jason never caused trouble. "He reads, writes, and prays," the guard told a local reporter. "Doesn't talk much, But when he does, it's usually about her. One night in May, Jason wrote a letter addressed to my daughter. It began in shaky handwriting. "You were going to be named after the man who destroyed us, but I'll remember you as Hope, because even in my darkest hour, I needed something pure." He ended it with, "I hope wherever souls go, you and your mother are together, and I hope you can forgive me for being human." The letter was never meant for the public. It was mailed to Melissa's mother with no return address, but a family friend leaked it to a local news station. Within hours, it spread across social media. News outlets called it the letter that broke America. Some read it as confession, others as redemption. Comment sections filled with divided opinions. "He's a murderer trying to look poetic." Another wrote, "That man's pain is the kind only betrayal can make." Hashtags trended on Twitter for weeks. Justice for Melissa, Free Jason, Letter to Hope. It became more than a case. It became a national debate about what love turns into when truth is withheld too long. Reporters tracked down Derek Harris for comment. Living quietly in Jacksonville under a new job, he declined to appear on camera. When pressed by a journalist over the phone, his only words were, "You think I don't live with this too?" The line disconnected. Public reaction turned hostile. His business was vandalized, and his family received threats. "He didn't pull the trigger, but he loaded the emotion," one caller said during a local radio show. Meanwhile, Melissa's mother released her own statement through her church. "My daughter made mistakes, but she didn't deserve to die for them," she said. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about not letting the pain turn you into what hurt you." Detective Angela Pierce, who had since been promoted, was asked to comment during a documentary interview that aired later that summer. Sitting against a dim backdrop, she said, "People want a label. What happened? Tragedy, passion, murder, heartbreak. But the truth is, it was all of those things at once. He didn't just kill his wife. He killed every version of himself that trusted love without asking questions." The camera lingered on her face as she added quietly, "The saddest part is, they all thought time would fix it. But time doesn't heal what you bury alive." Jason's letter remained the emotional center of the story. On online forums, readers analyzed every line. Some called it manipulative. Others found it painfully human. A psychologist interviewed on a morning show said, "It's the perfect storm. Guilt, love, and grief all tangled together. He's mourning what he did, but also what could have been." In prison, Jason received hundreds of letters, some from people offering prayers, others from those who had lived their own versions of betrayal. One inmate claimed he heard Jason whisper in his sleep, "Tell her I'm sorry," over and over again. Back at the Johnson home, the new owners found small traces of the past that couldn't be boxed up or painted over. A faint pink mark on the wall from where balloons had burst. A note inside a kitchen drawer that read, "Don't forget milk, and smile today." They kept the fridge magnet that said Baby Derica as a quiet reminder of the story that once unfolded there. It wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a cautionary tale written into the walls. Months later, a podcast replayed a clip from Jason's sentencing hearing. The judge had asked if he wanted to speak before the court finalized his sentence. He stood, hands trembling slightly, and said, "I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to stop the pain before it destroyed me." That recording ended the podcast episode with a question that still lingers over every retelling of the story. Was it love or ownership? Because when love becomes possession and truth becomes a weapon, what's left behind isn't just loss. It's the echo of a name that was never meant to be spoken that way again. The final chapter of this story doesn't begin with sound. It begins with silence. The kind that lingers long after the sirens fade, after the news crews pack up, and after the world finds a new tragedy to care about. It's been a year since that September afternoon, yet Savannah still remembers. The Johnsons' old home stands quiet, freshly painted, its new owners unaware of the ghosts it holds. But sometimes, when the wind cuts through the yard, the neighbors swear they can still hear laughter, the kind that once filled the air before it turned to screams. Detective Angela Pierce retired that spring. She told reporters she'd seen enough of love turned violent to last a lifetime. In her final interview, she said, "People always want a reason, but some truths never stop echoing. This case wasn't about hate. It was about what happens when pain goes unanswered for too long." She spent her last day at her desk, staring at a single evidence photo. The pink confetti frozen mid-air, a moment that should have symbolized new beginnings, but instead marked the end of 3 lives. Before leaving, she slid the photo into a drawer and whispered, "Some stories just don't leave you." Derek Harris left town 2 months after the trial ended. He sold his truck, closed his business, and moved to Florida under a different last name. When a journalist from the Savannah Chronicle caught up with him in June 2025, he refused to go on record. "I don't talk about that," he said. "I still see her face every time someone says her name." His eyes were red, his voice flat. When asked if he'd ever spoken to Jason after the verdict, he answered, "He wouldn't want to hear from me." Then, after a long pause, he added quietly, "Neither would I." Back at Georgia State Correctional, Jason Johnson spent his days working in the prison woodshop. He'd been granted permission to join a counseling program that allowed supervised family visits twice a month. During one of those sessions, an officer noticed him sitting in the visitation room, staring at the baby mobile hanging above the counselor's desk. It had small pink and white stars spinning slowly in the air. Jason watched it for nearly 5 minutes before saying, "That's what she wanted. Stars for the baby's room." The counselor asked if he believed things could have gone differently. Jason didn't look up when he answered, "If I had walked away that day, maybe I would have saved 3 lives, or maybe I just would have delayed the inevitable." It was the only statement he made that day, and the officer wrote it down, word for word. For Melissa's family, healing never came in headlines or closure. Her mother visits the cemetery every Sunday, placing fresh lilies on the shared headstone that reads, "Melissa and Hope Johnson, forever loved, forever missed." Rebecca, her sister, runs a support group now for women in struggling marriages. She ends each session the same way. "If it hurts in silence, it's already too loud." She told a reporter once that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let tragedy own the rest of your life. The world has mostly moved on. The story that once trended across social media is now a case study in a few college lectures and true crime documentaries like this one. Yet every retelling still ends the same way, with the confetti. In slow motion, the pink paper flutters upward, not falling this time, but rising, as if time itself is trying to undo what it saw. The laughter returns, the smiles freeze mid-frame, and Melissa's voice echoes once more, faint and distant. "We're naming her Derica." In a world obsessed with who's right or wrong, this story asks something else. What happens when both are broken? What happens when love becomes the weapon neither side knows how to put down? The camera lingers on Jason's face one last time, older now, quiet, his eyes following that same spinning mobile above him. There's no music, no verdict, no redemption. Only a question that haunts everyone who hears it. If he had walked away that day, would he have saved 3 lives, or only delayed the inevitable? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't leave in silence. Share it, so someone who feels trapped by love knows they're not alone. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us that behind every crime, there's a human heart trying and failing to do the right thing.